Okay, so this week we're going to go over social and environmental justice. So in this first section, we're going to answer these four basic questions. What is social justice? How is social justice related to social equity? What is environmental justice? And then, do we live in a socially just society? So first of all, let's define social justice. This is probably a term that you've heard, sometimes not in a positive light, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So social justice should not be a controversial topic. It is simply the view that everyone deserves equal economic, political, and social rights and opportunities. Now, this, like sustainability, there's no single definition of social justice, but this is the best succinct and descriptive definition that I found. It's from the National Association of Social Workers, so they know what they're talking about. But this is a really good way to break down what social justice means. So let's sort of unpack this definition a little bit and look at these three main components. So first we have economic rights and opportunities. So, go ahead and feel free to press pause and think about what that means. So economic rights and opportunities kind of refer to things like, economic opportunities, right? So job availability, fair wages, do you have access to training? Do you have access to education? Do you have good labor policies? Are you allowed to organize as a union? Do you get fair wages? Are there protections? Is there maternity and paternity leave? Is there, you know, um, unemployment insurance? All this sort of stuff. Uh, so again, the key here is that it's not that everyone should have the same amount of money. That is not social justice. I mean, that would be, but that's not what social justice advocates seek. Economic um, rights and opportunities, they just refer to the fact that it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, what your ethnic history is, what religion, what sexual orientation, what country you come from, whatever, gender, height, it doesn't matter. No matter who you are, you have uh, a fair opportunity and equal rights as everyone else. Okay, so do you have the right as I think of in the 1950s, in particular in the United States, if you're black, you don't have the same economic rights and opportunities. You're not going to get hired for the same jobs as white people could back then. Now, there certainly is still some lingering impacts of that. It's not as extreme, but that's a good example of economic injustice. Just by virtue of your skin color, you don't have the same economic opportunities, okay? So that's economic rights and opportunities. Now, political rights and opportunities. Now, keep in mind with this, it's not just about voting, it's about everything that's related to the political process, okay? So a really good example of this is the money in politics. In more now than ever, with some of the recent, Supreme Court rulings and so forth, the pervasiveness of money in politics is bigger than it has ever been. In order to get elected president, I mean, you have to have a lot of money, close to $1 billion in recent times. So that means it's very difficult for the average person, no matter how much aptitude they have, how intelligent they are, and so forth, how able they are to do the job. They're not going to get elected president. And if you're from certain ethnic groups, I mean, if you look at the list of presidents, we've had one black president. We've never had a female president. That doesn't mean that it's impossible, but it also is an indicator that not everyone has the fair opportunity to become president, and that's just president. You could look at local city councils, you could look at school boards. The ability to fully participate in a fair political process is a really important part of social justice. So can you actually fully participate? Is my vote as important as yours? Is my support as important as the wealthy guy next door? Okay. So voting rights are very important, but it's not the only thing. And lastly, we have social rights and opportunities. So this is kind of like a catch-all that includes a lot of different things: education, healthcare, general empowerment. Do you have control over your own life? Um, do you have live in the ability to live in a safe neighborhood? Is your community cohesion strong? Do you have access to housing? Do you have access to even over to clean air, clean water, and so forth? So social rights is kind of it includes a lot of different things. And to be honest, social rights, there's a lot in here and these two that are included in social rights as well. So these are not well-defined boundaries. I mean, these really mix together. Um, for example, it's hard to become politically powerful if you don't have job training and fair wages available to you. If you don't have good health care, it's kind of hard to hold down a really good job. So they're very much interrelated. So keep that in mind. But the point here is that social justice does not indicate that everyone should have the exact same education, everyone should have the exact same health care, everyone should have the same job and the same role in politics. So people that advocate for social justice understand the world is not a neat and clean place. It's not socialism. We don't expect everybody to have the same thing. The point is that everyone should have equal opportunities and equal rights. So there's a very important difference between not being educated because you're lazy and not being educated because you were born into a poor community. Okay, so it's very important to keep that in mind. All right. So environmental justice is very closely related, and it's a part of social justice. And you can think of it as the notion that all people should have access to a reasonably clean environment, regardless of who they are, income, ethnic background, and so forth. So the environmental justice refers specifically to environmental issues. So do people in low-income communities, are they more exposed to toxic air? Do they not have access to clean water? Maybe they don't have clean soil, whatever. So it's the sort of environmental side of these. And again, environmental justice is related to these. If you live in a toxic neighborhood, you probably have higher healthcare costs, which means you don't have the same economic rights and opportunities, which means it's probably harder to find a job, and there's probably a political reason, at least partially, at fault for that environmental injustice. So again, all this is very much interrelated. So I want to quickly address something. This is where you probably often hear about social justice, is this notion of social justice warriors. So there's, you could Google that, and there's all kinds of information out there. So I just want to bring that to your attention, and that gives social justice a bad name. But I had a friend of mine that one time told me this, and I found it pretty insightful. So social justice, as she put it, means people in wheelchairs should have access to facilities, right? So they have fair access to the same facilities that fully able-bodied people have. But a social justice warrior gets mad at you for being able to walk. So that's kind of that fine line, and we all kind of know there's certain people out there that are just a little bit unreasonable, a little bit irrational about demanding, getting angry at people for things that it's not necessarily their fault. So in a way, the quote-unquote social justice warriors, they kind of take the social justice a little too far, and they tend to act a little bit irrationally. Usually their heart's in the right place, and they actually want what's good for people. But they can, I agree, give social justice kind of a bad name. Again, the things that they're fighting for, generally speaking, are things that most people would want and social justice advocates would want. But I just wanted to bring that to your attention because that does tend to give social justice a bad name. But if you really think about it, social justice is really the, at the heart of this American ideal, right? I mean, everyone's supposed to have equal opportunity in the US, and that's social justice. So it really should not be a controversial topic. Okay, so there was a short reading from Reliable Prosperity. So Reliable Prosperity is like a business, it's an organization that sort of helps businesses become sustainable. And so they define social equity. So social equity they define as fair access to livelihoods, resources, and so forth, okay? And so again, social justice and social equity are basically the same thing. It's all about fair access. It's not that everybody should have the same thing, but it's that everyone should have access to these things that we believe lead to a high quality of life. And they say the full participation in political and cultural life of community, self-determination. So all this stuff, it's basically social justice, all right? It's fair access. So social equity and social justice are effectively the same thing. Okay, so we can look at this from a very much like a justice perspective, but from a practical perspective, as they point out in this article, when you have a more socially equitable society, some other side benefits occur. They note that you think about a socially just society where people have access to education and healthcare and jobs, you're going to spend less on prisons, you're going to spend less on security, you're going to spend less on policing, you're going to spend less on welfare. So when you have someone that's like, hey, we don't want to give these handouts to people, if you can help people become more educated, offer them opportunities, by and large, if the opportunities are there, they're much more likely to take advantage of them. And if that's the case, then you can help them help themselves, and then you can eliminate a lot of these social services. You don't need as much welfare or TANF as they call it now. Okay, so there is a very practical reason to advocate for social justice. And also, I mean, looking from an economic perspective, as you know, remember this is like a consulting organization for businesses. If we have a more socially just, a more educated people that have decent jobs, the people that are healthy, you actually open up new markets, so people are able to afford, able to participate in the economy. And they give some reasons for this. I mean, this is a really short article, so they don't go into too much explanation. But they note that, if you are living on the margins, just imagine you're just living hand to mouth. You don't, you barely know where your next paycheck or your next meal is coming from. It can be very tempting to be like, look, I don't care. I don't care about like the long-term impacts of what I'm doing. I need to survive. And so it's, I would say, justifiable for someone that's really struggling to get by to not think about what's happening to future generations. I mean, they're thinking about their family or themselves right now, so that can be a problem. Again, you can counteract that with social justice, giving them access to a lot of these resources. And also on the flip side of that, if you're very wealthy, it tends to we tend to overconsume as part of being wealthy. Okay. So they mentioned true cost pricing. Okay. So if you think about that, this is very similar to something we talked about before. They say it's pricing that accurately reflects social costs and benefits. So this should ring a bell. So they're really talking about externalities here. Okay, so they mentioned that we need to actually reflect in the price the true cost of that good, that service, whatever it is. So again, one of the points here is these are concepts we've talked about. Again, this is something that it's not just something we talk about in class. This is something that's out there that businesses recognize, that consulting organizations recognize. So these are really important issues. Okay, so let's look at some um, whether or not we live in a socially equitable society. Like, do we have economic and rights? Economic rights and opportunities? We have political rights and opportunities. We have social rights and opportunities. So you can think about that, but let's look at a few pieces of evidence that indicate that maybe we're not living in such a socially equitable society. Okay, so this is really interesting. This is a summary of a study by a few folks from Harvard and Duke University. So what they did is they surveyed a bunch of people. This is peer-reviewed academic research, so really legitimate. So they surveyed a whole bunch of people, and they asked them a series of questions. Okay, and so one of the questions they asked is of all of the income in the U.S. Okay, and you take here's the richest 20% of Americans. There's the second 20%, the third 20%, the fourth, and these are the poorest 20%. Okay, so they asked them, how well distributed do you think the income should be in the U.S.? And here's what the average person said, about the top 20% should have about 30% of the wealth, and the bottom 20% should have about 10%. Okay, so they said, yes, we understand that it's not going to be perfectly distributed. So this is their ideal. Okay, and then they asked them, okay, whoops, what do you think it actually is? And here's what people actually thought it was. Okay, so here's their ideal, 30% to the top 20%, but they actually guessed that the top 20% had about 60% of the wealth, and the bottom 20% had about 5%. Okay, so this is what they would like it to be. This is what they think it is, and here's how it actually looks like. Okay, so the actual distribution of wealth in the United States. I'm chuckling. I mean, it's just so ridiculous. It's not funny, really. The top 20% have about 85% of all the wealth. Now, keep in mind, this isn't just the income. This is wealth. So this is, property, material, possessions, whatever. Um, and the bottom 20% is not even on here. In fact, the bottom 60% only have about 10% of the wealth. Okay, so this just shows you, this is an indicator, I think, of not of a lack of economic opportunity for the low income in the United States. And that, of course, also bleeds over into political. So if you have more money, you have more political influence, and it's also sort of a byproduct and an indicator of social injustice as well. Um, you look at the average CEO pay, so the CEO of companies, this is the top 350 US firms from 1980 to 2014. And you look at this from the percent increase in CEO pay since 1980, it's up about 1,000%. The average worker is up about 11%. Okay, so again, bigger disparity between the rich and poor. I found this really interesting. This is a chart that indicates what's called a healthcare access and quality index. So these researchers, they actually looked at mortality rates for these 32 diseases and injuries that are usually not fatal when effective medical care. So basically, these are preventable deaths, right? So you have, I don't know, like dysentery, diarrhea, whatever, maybe the flu, where if you don't have medical treatment, it can be very fatal. If you do, then it's not less likely to be fatal. So the red means they're dying unnecessary deaths because of lack of health care. Down to the green and blue and purple, they are able to survive these diseases and injuries, okay? And so feel free to press pause and think about some patterns you see here. The one that jumps out to me right away is we have our sub-Saharan Africa, really bad healthcare access and quality, okay? We have India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, okay? So they're much more likely to die of a preventable death than people in, say, the United States, okay? What I also find interesting is that the US is not the best. These countries that have more universal health care, okay, your Europe, Scandinavian countries, Western Europe, right? So all these countries have healthcare. It's basically universal healthcare. So that's another story there. But anyway, this is a strong indicator of a lack of social justice, okay? And then if you just look at another piece of evidence, your average household income, again, this is from 1967 to 2012. You look at the top 5% are making more, their income has risen significantly, whereas the bottom have either stayed flat or decreased. And then you look at the percent of all income in the United States of the top people. So the top 5% have an increasing amount, whereas the bottom 80% actually have less percent of all the income that they did since 1967. Okay, so again, an indicator of economic inequality. Okay, just a couple more quick things here. First of all, if you look at the Fortune 500, the top 500 companies, there's 24 out of the 500 are headed by females. Okay, now again, I'm not saying there should necessarily be a 50-50 split, but the fact that there's only 5% of them are female, it's an indicator of a lack of economic, political, and social opportunities based on gender. Okay, so it's an indicator. I mean, this is not like this doesn't happen just organically. This has to do with unequal opportunity. And the last one here, if you look at this has become a really big issue with if you have a felony conviction, there are about 6 million people in 2016 weren't allowed to vote because of felony convictions. This is becoming a big topic. This is a state-by-state issue. But again, a lack of political opportunity for people that have a felony on their record. So I want to kind of leave you with these last thoughts. See if, read through this. Have you ever heard, this notion that you can be anything you want to be in the US if you work hard enough? So it's not, doesn't sound like too bad of a thing. But I want you to think about what's the implication of this statement if you're not, quote unquote, successful. So think about if it's true that you can be anything you want to be if you work hard enough, what does it mean if you're not what you want to be? Okay. So I think the clear indication here or implication here is that if you're not successful, that means you didn't work hard enough. And that's the dangerous part of that piece of rhetoric, in that if that's assumed to be true, that means it's really easy to say, well, you don't have much money, you're poor, you don't have, you're not successful, or that means you're not a hard worker. And while that could be true, that's not always true. Do all rich people work harder than all poor people? Is there like an exact scale, like, oh, you're twice as wealthy, that means you work twice as hard? I think we all know that that's not the case. Now, this is not to say that all rich people are lazy or all low-income people work really hard. The point is we have to be very careful about assuming that just because that people are in their place in society because of what they've earned, um, where if you think about it, that's not always the case. I'm sure we all know people that work really hard but don't have much money, and we all know people that have money that don't work really hard, okay? And so you really want to think about, if you work hard in the US, are you likely to get ahead? And if you look at the index, this is basically a social mobility index. Um, and so the higher you are on the scale, the less likely, what it really means is the higher you go on the scale, the more likely it is that wealthy parents have wealthy children. And so when you go lower on the scale, that means you don't have to have a wealthy parent to have a wealthy child. On average, these are all average numbers. And you can see that the US is really high on the scale, meaning it's relatively common for wealthy people to have wealthy kids, where you go to somewhere like Denmark, Norway, Finland, Canada, where they have more social mobility, that it's a little easier for low-income people to become wealthy, and vice versa, wealthy people to be low income. Okay? Okay, so that's it for this part.